Hi, hello. Hey, Jason.
Hey, how are you, Sonia?
I'm good. It's been ages. Good to see you.
You too.
Um, Welcome back, everyone. Welcome to Disasters Deconstructed live stream, and welcome to season 7. Season 7. Unbelievable.
Yeah. How many years? This is
Three. Three.
like three years since we started.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Feels like
So
30.
as you probably oh come on, I'm not that bad. So since this is like season 7 and we're on a live stream, you probably figured out we're doing something different this season. So what we're going to do, and we mentioned this at the end of last season, I think, didn't we?
We
Is
did. Yeah, we did. Yeah.
to do live streams with guests every 2 weeks, and then after we do a live stream recording, we're going to release the audio episodes later in the week after they get edited. So if you're watching this live and have questions, please post them, interact with the episodes, and yeah, this and we're just going to see how it goes. We want to do something a little bit different, as many of you will have joined us for live streams before. We've been doing a lot of that in the last year. So we thought, why not do a whole season as in this format? And
Yeah,
let us know what you think.
yeah. And it should be fun. We like live
Hmm.
streams, so see how this goes. But it's not just the format that is different, because this season we want all of you to read with us. So not just to listen to the episodes and engage, but actually read with us. And so for the duration of the season, we are going to talk about books. You may or may not have realized that Jason and I really love books. We love reading. Our biggest problem is that we have too many books and not enough shelf space in our offices, in our houses. But um,
Yeah, that's what
that's
happens when you like join book clubs and then you get sent new books all the time, and they accumulate, right?
yeah.
I think I get more books than I manage to read. So
Absolutely. And like I read a lot and even I can't get through them. But anyway, we love reading, we love books. And so this is what we're going to do this season. And so we will be meeting in the season with some of the authors of the books that we have really enjoyed this year. But most importantly, we will be exploring how reading, and in particular reading outside of kind of disaster study discipline, right? And disciplinary silos in general shapes us as disaster scholars. And so we really, really hope that you will join us on this journey. And this season, we are pairing up with the GREEP project, which is funded by GCRF in the UK and led by Maureen Fordham in UCL. And I'm sure many of you know Maureen. And I'm also involved in the project. And we are bringing with us Camilo Buono, who will be co-curating the season and who is also involved in the project, because we want to dive kind of really, really deep into critical theory and see what critical practice and praxis is needed for critical times.
so it's probably about time to bring our co-curator for the season onto the screen.
Yay.
So welcome, Camilo. Hey, how are you?
Hello, I'm very well. Yourself?
Good. Thanks for joining us. And so,
Thank
yeah, for
you.
everybody watching, Camilo will also be joining us in the second half of the season as we discuss the different books that we're reading as a collective, as a co-host for the season. So we're really happy about this. And for those of you who don't know Camilo, Camilo is a professor in urban design and critical theory at the Bartlett Development Planning Unit, and also professor in architecture and urban design at the Politecnico di Torino, Italy. He's co-director of the UCL Urban Laboratory, and his research is centered on the interfaces between critical theory, radical philosophy, and urban design processes. He's also working on a series of interconnected research projects in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East on urban infrastructures, habitability, and the urban project. So we're just so excited that you agreed to join us for this season and to bring your expertise to these discussions. So welcome.
Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm super happy because you said that it's season 7 is like being on something that
Yeah.
is now a classic on disaster thinking. So I'm super, super, super happy to be here and really thrilled and even a little bit intimidated, as you know. But it's super nice, and being with you in season 7, it's super, super. So look forward for the conversation and the next step. So thank you very much.
Amazing. It's going to be fun.
Yeah, thank you. It really is. And I thought, we've talked a lot and prepared a lot for this season. And those who have been following on Twitter will know we kind of put out polls to try to choose the books that we would read and everything. And before that, there was a lot of thinking just about how we would structure it and how we would kind of devise themes. So I wanted to, first of all, ask the two of you who kind of did a lot of that early thinking about the season. When you were devising the plan for the season, you called it you gave it the title "Rereading Theory as a Liberatory Practice." And so, why did you give it this working title? What does liberatory practice mean to you, and how can theory help with liberation struggle? Maybe come to you, Camilla, first.
To me first. Okay, thank you very much. It's I think there's two issues. The first one is the title refer directly back to one of the reading that Xenia was sort of sharing the interest with, both at the present but also in the past, which is Bell Hooks book. So I think it's referred directly to her use of the word of theory as liberation. And I think that when we were discussing, has probably two dimensions that we were sort of attaching to the aiming of the season. On one side is actually to think, and this is her word again, to think, and for her is critical thinking literally as a laboratory, as an experiment, has a way of doing that together with not a prescript, if you want, but also with this idea of exploring literature, but also thinking with others, which I think is probably the most interesting element of liberation. But on the other is also the liberation connected on the way we think our life. And she says deliberately in the opening of I think chapter 4 of the book, is understanding how life works for her is a very fundamental theoretical dimension. And she says at the beginning, I came to theory because I was hurting. The pain within me was so intense that I could not go on living. I came to theory desperate, wanting to comprehend, to grasp what was happening around and within me. And I think that is probably the sort of umbrella thinking that liberation is very so thinking theory not as a way to explain or to justify, or not to explain and justify only, but to actually grasp possibilities, alliances, reflections, people, and other forms of connection, to actually think a possible way out. Now, liberation is also a big word, but in some contexts that we work with, of course, liberation means a line of fight, if you want, a way out of situations that are both emancipatory but also more serious, out of the pain of the crisis conditions where we are out and on in. So that was a sort of initial reflection on understanding, but if you want, thinking with, through, and without any solution. And I think that is sort of hypothetical working through. So not looking for neither truth or solution, but aiming to, as in a laboratory, in a sort of experimental manner, crafting different thinking and learning from the crafting of different thinking that emerge elsewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I really like that you mentioned truth here, because this is something we see so much, right? And this is where thinking is required. It's almost kind of accepted that there is this truth, and we as objective scholars, right, can find that truth, and then the truth would lead to knowledge. But as Foucault writes, knowledge was invented, but truth was invented later still. And I think kind of thinking together, right, and turning thinking into practice allows us to perhaps develop some kind of power within us to fight in a struggle for the production of truth, right, and multiple truths, non-universal truth. I think it's also really important to say that in our discussions, right, when we started talking about it, I think both of us kind of acknowledged that in no way are we trying to influence people in a way that they should think, right. This is not what critical theory is about. Critical theorists are not influencers, and it's the idea of kind of influence per se isn't really kind of complementary here at all. But instead, what we want to encourage is to use and perhaps deploy, and kind of evaluate a little bit more the interpretation of other people's writings and practices to pursue our own political interventions, right, and kind of our ideological interventions. So it is not our aim to turn everybody into activists, but to just engage in a dialogue, in a conversation that perhaps will help us think together.
Something I was thinking while you were both responding to that about the why of the season and why critical was like how it connects to our previous season when we were looking at different approaches to research, different methodologies, different philosophies, and so for me, I think of critical theory and the influence of the Frankfurt School on a certain philosophy of research, which influences a lot of the people that we talked to last season in the way that they approach their work, right? Because last season we talked a lot about the kind of the tyranny of the dominant school of thought, which is positivism, in the academy, and critical inquiry really challenges that in a way that post-positivism doesn't really, or interpretivism doesn't really. Critical theory, I think, fits with a lot of the people in disaster studies who are really challenging the foundations of society, and aren't afraid to be political with their research. And so that's why it's really exciting to me to look a bit deeper into theory, and because I think a lot of people that have been on the podcast before are influenced by the theory, but maybe it's not always clear why they're doing the research the way that they are,
Yeah, I totally agree. I think kind of critical theory almost helps us to maybe demystify the kind of the illusions, right, that we have about disasters, and kind of how disasters are created, and they expose the consequences a bit more. And we'll talk a little bit about this later on. But Camilo, I want to ask you a pretty straightforward question, right, before we dig deep into sort of practice and theory. I mean, the word critical has really become a buzzword, right? All of a sudden, everybody is doing critical. And it almost feels like people are trying to sort of reinvent maybe disaster scholarship, right? By just adding critical in front of whatever it is they're doing. But what does critical actually mean?
Well, this is the $1 million question that probably we have to unfold. And I think, as a disclaimer and maybe as an introduction, let's start with the fact that whenever we speak about criticality and critical theory together, if you want, is a very slippery territory. And so we need to keep it very, with cautious, with calm, and with different sets of interpretation. As Jason was saying, when we speak about critical theory, we mean a lot of things. And therefore, the meaning of the lot of things, including the capture by populism and self critique that is very recently brought. I mean, if you can imagine all the debate with the pandemic that we all, in a manner or another, were going through, the criticality was actually could be captured by a systems that is actually not the one that you want. There are scholars that speaks about critical theory, as you were saying, Jason, that are back to the Frankfurt School. So in a very specific historical moment where, the relationship between the knower and the researcher, the who research and who has a theory, this little issue about the abstractness of the dialectic of negativity and all sorts of things. That prove after the Second World War in a very peculiar European environment, and therefore was very criticized to be ineffective, to be non-liberatory, and so on. So there are many traditions of that. And I think there are two issues that maybe is worth to clarify very initially, is going back to one definition that was actually done by Foucault, not speaking directly into that, but in a little, in one lecture that was titled "What is Enlightenment?" and was a critique, of course, of that moment of the history. And he says that critique is, in essence, nothing but an assessment of an intervention into the present with the view to an altered future. So critique is actually thinking with, of course, the baggage of different epistemologies, concepts, relation, positions, tools, the present, but aiming to imagine an altered, so to act onto the future. So the first thing that I want to flag is this idea of theory practice. To a certain extent, whenever we speak about critical theory, we speak about the doing, we speak about praxis, we're speaking about a very specific forms of activity. So it's not an intellectual flyover endeavor, but it's actually really thinking on. Maybe it is not a specific physical project, maybe it's not immediately something visible, but surely has practical dimension. Foucault was saying that critical theory is a sort of curious activity. So curiosity is always the fact of being insufficiently unhappy with the present, being conditions and so on. And doesn't mean for a future or a truth, he says, that will not or happen. So to a certain extent, critique is always a question for the present, but looking at the transformation of the present. So, of course, could be grounded in historical level in reflection, could be grounded in network dimension, but of course, he's looking at what we want, he's looking to the future. So the idea of adding, what you were saying, adding the critical, well, no, I'm afraid doesn't work if there is no the mechanics, of course. So the negativity, the contestation, the liberation, and so on. There's another point which I think is worth adding, which is that it's probably the specific condition where we are at in this moment of crisis, but also in the moment of specific liberalisms around which we are. So the question of criticality remain how actually critical theory today is limited in the understanding the global capitalism and the forms of governance that are emerging from that. I mean, think about the idea of Anthropocene that, of course, has been coming through the different sessions. So, in a way, is it possible to think with the same category, place, relationship, and knowledge that actually was constructing this condition? And I think that is the criticality of, is being out of the box, is being innovative, is being thinking about alternatives. So the notion of negativity is certainly there. But there is a point which I want to go back, because Jason was mentioning the original Frankfurt School, which was problematic historically, was critical on one side, was then to be ineffective. But Horkheimer, in one of the very fundamental texts, I think was 53, says that the role and the practical ambition of critical theory is, and I'm quoting, man's emancipation from slavery. And if you connect back to that very moment of history, that was a very fundamental component. Of course, man at that very time has to be of course, updated, right, with a different dimension. But emancipation was a central point, and slavery is exactly that point, which is not only the historical moment of slavery per se, but slavery from capitalism, from control, from governance, and I would say now the absence of future, which is actually this idea of complex multiple crises that are affecting us. So I do believe that it's the mimic and the maquillage of just adding critical is not enough. Critical is not immediately a solution for being radical, nor to finding a solution. So sometimes is going back to the critical authors or individual thinking or alternative thinking that help these mechanics, if you want, or tools for criticality to a certain extent. And of course, the self-reflexivity whenever we are critical, it's probably out of fashion, is overdue. We need something more. In a way, being situated, being ingrained with specific geography. The current tradition of critical thinking is speaking about two gestures that are, to me, very central: reappraisal and decentering. The reappraisal is bringing criticality as a gesture at the center of the practice, whatever discipline, whatever attitude. And the decentering is really going outside, is thinking from outside, is being situated elsewhere to be able to think differently, which for some is going south, for others is going east, for others is moving to other forms of authors, to unresolved and overlooked questions, but still with the idea of analyzing the present in order to transform, to think the future.
So I guess when we talk about critical, right, in particularly in the context of kind of disaster scholarship, we need to keep re-emphasizing what's at the heart of critical philosophy, right? And that is not just the interpretation of the world, but change it, right? How we change the world. And this is where kind of critical praxis comes to play, in that I feel that critical praxis doesn't really call for more reporting, right, or for more studies, and that's what we kind of keep doing, right? We keep kind of wanting more and innovative, I used in quotation marks, but rather what we should be calling for is practices and acts that address the deficit in trust, maybe, right, and that kind of rebuild our shared practices in our common world.
Oh yes, absolutely. That's there are two dimensions to me that are central to the critical disaster studies, if you want to have as an example. It's probably the first gesture, or the first thing is as many recent literature, some of our friends that has been developed, is actually thinking is resisting the if you want, the seduction or the temptation that disasters scholars knows. It's about not knowing and embracing this idea of not being able to know and to calculate either risks or the vulnerabilities or all the different ingredients. And one component of being critical is actually probably to resist that calculative dimension. Now, calculative both in the practical, quantitative sense that you mentioned, reporting, numerical, scientific, but also resisting the position of the expert, both at the critical level or not. I think that is, and also the status quo of the discipline. Each discipline was born in a very specific moment, and I do think the idea about transdisciplinarities, connection, hybridation, experimentation, alternative methodologies, decolonial methodologies, all these different language are going into that direction to a certain extent. So dismantling or attempting to dismantle or reducing is kind of a refusal of the status quo. So a language that is purely in a feminist thinking or in a Black feminist thinking literature is absolutely the idea of the no, the refusing to stand for a no, to stop a thinking. but and therefore the other question is probably questioning what knowledge and how knowledge and whose knowledge. And I think that is peculiarly for us. And I think most of your work into the different seasons was actually, at least in the way I have interpreted and listened and was actually question who has that knowledge and what are the knowledge that is developed within specific sets of disciplines. And who holds that? Who holds either the truth or the actually the secret more than the truth? Because I think that is even more perverse, which is the secrets of knowing, and therefore the institution that is preserved within that. And therefore opening for other forms of knowledge, no? Which other people are, constructing the knowledge, who is entitled to speak, right? Who is entitled to speak, who is entitled to participate, who is entitled to be there, who is entitled to be part of it, invited or not. I think that is an element that is quite important too. But the third element maybe is this idea of crisis, which I think is important. Crisis is also the not being able to think about the narratives, the narrative and the discourse that are framing around. And I think the disaster studies is, to a certain extent, very complicit to a regimes of dimensions of constructing both the narrative of the crisis, the positivity of the future. And I think some of the elements that some of the environment and places where we learn to think from speaks about failure, speaks about incompleteness, speaks about struggle at the everyday life, which are never making a project so explicitly perfect, sophisticated, well presented, well done. And I do believe that element is super very critical. And I think that was an original project of criticality. So to not be to transgress to a certain extent. But crisis has also been a moment of a discourse that was actually, preserving a possibility of the future, diverting the direction of the future, exceptionalities versus other forms of control, which I think all of us have been experiencing in a manner or another. So to a certain extent, he's actually thinking about what's the future we want and how we're going to live together. Which to me bring a very important intersectional dimension of, and I think that is very different from the original, Frankfurt School. Today, the challenge is really to think about intersection, interspecies, intertiming. So the complexity of the different time dimension around we think, the future or what is left to the future remain very, very peculiar to the present. And the question would remain, do we have the language that is equipped to think about that? Do we need other language, concepts, practice, and reflection, which I think is a very interesting challenge for all of us.
Yeah, this is so interesting. And I love I think, Ksenia, you might have been channeling Paulo Freire there and talking about like the way Freire talked about critical consciousness, and connected criticality to action, And so and I think in disaster studies, we see the word critical and maybe the word radical as well, thrown in as in front of something to indicate that, almost to indicate like in an elite kind of way, like that I know something here that, like you said, Camilla, like a secret. And that's kind of the opposite of the way that Freire or bell hooks use criticality. So that's a really interesting insight. And I wanted to talk about this, something that comes up for us quite often, which is the accusation of being political, and like the challenge to that position, where like we believe that knowledge is political and we can't escape this. But in the academy, you'll often get pushback on this, that you're too ideological, or you're politicizing something that should be objective. And this is something, of course, that's been discussed a lot in critical philosophy and theory by Edward Said, Patricia Hill Collins, many others. Why do you think that we get so much pushback when we use this kind of theory to inform our work? And then how can we deal with that? How can we like rebuff those kind of challenges to actually using criticality in disaster studies? Ksenia, what do you think?
Ksenia, yeah, go ahead.
Oh wow, okay. Just drop me there, Jason.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah, I mean, you know what I think. To me, kind of personally, as you said, everything that we do is political. There is no, because knowledge means power, right? And everything that is connected to the power is therefore political. There is no way escaping that. We cannot say that power is objective, right? And well, I guess the Queen's power, some would think, is right, given from wherever, the top, the bottom, I'm not entirely sure. But anyhow, this kind of the discussion about political is, I feel, the fear, is driven by the fear of giving something up, perhaps giving up that power of the knowledge that we as experts have, right? We as academy have, and that's the ivory towels. How can we accept as academics that we perhaps do not hold all the truth, right? That we do not know everything, and there might be other knowledges out there, right? Which we may wish to embrace, and yeah, I guess this is where the question arises, right? And this is where the pushback arises, and I'm sure Camillo will tell us how to, what to do about it and find the solution to this problem.
Not at
Yeah,
all.
no pressure.
Absolutely.
No pressure.
No, but I think I think it's an important question to continuously being asked. And I think historically, and probably disciplinary, we need to make several distinctions, no? Because not in all the historical moment when critical thinking or critical theory or this debate, being political was always an easy decision to be made. And I do believe that the political is, to a certain extent, I think, is an act of choice, of refusing to be neutral. And I think that is something that is a struggle that each individual in the different position that we are having as, men, women, teachers, practitioners, fathers, in the different roles that we are having, is a continuous struggle. So it's never fixed. It's contingent to the conditions where we are. But refusing the neutrality is meaning to me two important things, which is taking side, is sitting with or deciding a position. Early in the 90s, the debate about disasters was centered about this idea of participation, and that in that historical moment, if you recall, or any other discourses, that was meant to take sides. Now, of course, it was taken differently. There was moment of inefficiency of that. What I think is important also to flag out is that critical thinking not necessarily is a direct or not immediately is a political action. So it's not that everybody has to be an activist, as you were saying at the beginning. Everybody has to take a position, to stand in solidarity, stand within and confront. But the tension between critical theory and political action is not a tension of immediacy. There are mediations into it. I think that is an history, for example, that comes from critical literal studies or critical theory, more in the sense of literature and why I think that is important, because I think that the political dimension comes when you deal with three gestures of the critical thinking. One is the distinction. And the distinction is in a way is a judgment, is that you decide. There is a judgment of critical, imply, even in the etymology of the term, imply a judgment, a value discussion, and therefore imply dividing, good and bad, right and wrong, and so forth. But there's also an element of contradictions, and that is where politicality stands, which is disclosing the contradiction within, discourses, and the contradiction maybe are the one that are come from knowledge and non-knowledge, knowing and not knowing, and so on. But it's also a kind of a distance, which is a negative thinking, both in terms of impact, but also is continuously thinking the otherwise. And I think that is what makes the politics more complicated, because it's a suspension of an act. In some moment of philosophical theory, the action was actually a suspension of the action in order to allow for other forms of thinking. Think about phenomenology, or think about, the current debate about refusal of politics, or even the abolition discussions that we are touching at some points of the books later on, which is actually allowing cracks into the thinking, into the regimes, into the discourse. And that was not necessarily an immediate, political dimension, maybe not always, but was always, creating a separation, a moment of stop where you can judge, when you can confront, and when you can stand. And I think that is what makes that position a political dimension, which is you stand, you are there with your body, with your physicality, you're situated into a tension, in a confrontation, in a reflection. And so I believe to a certain extent that, the risk to making political and repoliticize is not to make theory just for some and not for others, or something that is not needed at the moment. We need it more, actually. We need it more in order to become more political. And I think that is a struggle across many disciplines, and probably political theory, critical literature in that sense, are all to a certain, for their own historical trajectory, more, a keep, right, rather than us, us disaster studies, us architecture and planning, which are, super operative and always confronting the action. And I think that is being political, I think is also being capable of, standing and, allowing concepts and thinking to happen in order to stand always in solidarity, so always within that regimes. And I think that is important, but they are never a direct action. So in a way that you can label yourself a critical, and therefore there is an action that is immediately political. I think that is something we need to be careful, at least. So no solution.
Shame. We thought you'd go. You'd give us an answer to the question. Maybe by the time you come back, right, in the second part of the season, you'll have a solution for us. So no pressure, Camilla. But as you were kind of talking now, and something you referred to before, is that the idea of crisis, right? And kind of crisis and critique, they go hand in hand. And so Sayla Ben Habib, she emphasizes that critical theory must also be a theory of crisis. And of course, we of course need to kind of know that this is not a unidirectional relationship, right? And so we need to combine both perspectives to understand the relationship between critique and crisis. And perhaps we can say that we now are living in one of the most, if not the most, critical periods of human history, where critical kind of is taken in its most formative etymological sense, right? Our political situation, our climate, our world, our everyday are in critical condition. And by critical, of course, here, right, we mean not great, to say the least. And so we are perhaps at a turning point from which we may never recover, right? If we do not act now, when we should have been acting for a long time. So to use Chernyshevsky's phrase, or and some attributed to Lenin, what is to be done, and what is the role of scholarship, of praxis, of the community, and of and I use I here in quotation mark, in it? What is to be done?
I think it's important, again, is it one of the important questions that we can collectively probably try to engage with across the different sessions that we are going to curate. That was a very important moment of literature, when calling for action was very important. But let me flip it in a moment at the present. For example, there is another traditions more close to the present that speaks about an idea of undoing rather than doing. And I'm referring to all this very important debate that comes from the decolonial thinking, the Black radical, certain feminism of a specific author. Maybe the question is, at the moment, is being able to undo certain systems rather than immediately going for action. So going back to the title, probably is really to think this idea of what to do is to transfer the question is how to liberate every single practice that we are engaging with. And liberation sometimes might be in relation to concepts, discourse, dimensions, institutions. With others might be with a very specific engagement with a territory, liberation from risk, liberation from other forms of slavery of different forms and sorts. So I think this idea of undoing is actually twofold, is not running into an action that sometimes is actually at the moment probably rethinking the way we could think the system. There is a word here that I think this literature, and some of them is the one that we have sort of, which the people, the followers have selected, is going to think about this idea of abolition. And abolition is not only referring to, the very typical US-based joke, but is moving outside that prison discourse, carceral discourse, but is an abolition of the systems that somehow is constructing the very reality. So undoing sometimes is meaning suspending the judgments and just trying to find other voices, inviting other people to think through. So I do believe this call for action somehow can be transferred into something that is maybe what is to be done is to listen. What is to be done is to finding different alliances, different category of thinking, different mode of engagement, different material through which doing. So I do believe, whether, of course, the what you refer back to, sort of very Leninist, the vision of the critical thinking is still very appropriate, but maybe has to be translated, if you want, into something that is at the very condition of. And the reason is actually what you started from, to me, which is, crisis is not new, but we've been living in crisis since. And we are not able to dismantle this idea of crisis. Crisis has been forcing us to exception, forcing us to do things that we didn't wanted to. And the discourse about crisis that we're still living with no future. So maybe we need to reshuffle a little bit the idea of desire, maybe. There is a Ferreira da Silva, which is another critical Black scholar, that says something that I found extremely interesting to respond to this idea of what to do. And maybe she says something that I found super, and I'm quoting, maybe it's to ask different questions, methodological rather than ontological, so rather than on the being. So the point is not who and what we are, but is to go deeper into an investigation on how we come up with the answer. So back to the idea of undoing, maybe what to do is changing methodologies, is thinking on the way we do things. And I found that this is probably very problematic. So what we're speaking of here, I think, and the session, the season actually is getting super excited because it's actually very difficult, very very slippery the territory, but very difficult because we might not be able actually to find immediate answer of what to do, but maybe we need other questions to be posed. And I know that part of the beautiness and deepness of the critical disaster studies has been actually to continuously question that methodology, whatever methodology. And I do believe asking the correct question today is one way to confronting with this idea of crisis, maybe the very notion of crisis too.
Indeed.
To me, one thing, sorry, that
No, go.
I was thinking was about like the role of the researcher in disaster studies, the role of the scholar, the role of the person who goes into the field to do their research, right? And that to me is like your approach to that, your philosophical approach to that is very important and influential, and affects the outcome, not only of the project, but has impacts on the people that you interact with. And if we're talking about liberation, like we need to be really careful in the way that we engage in research, the way we engage in struggles, the way we work with oppressed people. You know, and I think we talked about this to some degree in a lot of the episodes last season about ethical ways to be a researcher. And I'm excited about this season, because, like, as you know, we have a lot of disaster researchers and practitioners that listen, and I think really asking these deep questions about our philosophical approach can hopefully be transformative, in the way that some people look at their own practice, and help people to reflect. I'm excited just listening to this discussion today.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've been kind of on the margins of this, right? You and I had so many conversations over the years, which kind of try to unpack this all. And I'm just so glad that in this season we are able to do this with Camilla. I guess, with what is to be done, and I'm thinking, from my perspective here as an educator as well, it is very much about opening up the space for kind of critique and praxis to all voices in equal time and with equal space, right? In other words, I guess empowering, for choice of a better word, I don't really like that word, but empowering those who are not heard, and also mobilizing those who are not really affected by a crisis, right? Because they're in a privileged position. And it's about us as educators teaching about just societies and promoting justice, right? And kind of motivating students and creating social networks that are built on solidarity and, critical leftist values. And I really, really hope that we will be unpacking all of this for the remainder of the season, particularly when we start reading the books. I wish we had more time for this introduction, but we do have to wrap up. But before we finish, let me remind all of you about the books that we're going to read in the season. So as Jason mentioned already, we had polls on Twitter. So thank you all so much for making us choose the books. You should have seen the kind of background discussions between Camilo, Jason, and me about trying to narrow things down to 4 books. So we will actually be providing reading lists, because we do have reading lists. Of course we do, right? We want you all to read. But the 4 books that we will start reading from early September are Malcolm Ferdinand's Decolonial Ecology, Thinking from the Caribbean World, Max Liboran's Pollution is Colonialism, Paulo Freire's, of course, Pedagogy of Indignation. We couldn't not mention Paulo Freire in this season. We do every season. And finally, Silvia Federici's Patriarchy of the Wage. So please get the books. Please engage with us. We will be inviting different guests to talk about these books, and Camillo will be leading the discussion. So yeah, thank you so much, Camillo, for joining us today. It's been absolutely fantastic.
Thank you very much, and thank you, everyone. It's again, it's very nice to be with you finally, and I'm super looking forward for a conversation around which we might not have any answer, but I'm sure would be fantastic to engage through thinking of others, which we probably need and will help us. So thank you very much.
And just before we wrap up, I think Jason's internet dropped a little bit. Before we wrap up, please join our season 7 that we started today. Our next live stream will be in 2 weeks' time. And so for now, happy reading. Enjoy the reading. And please follow us on Twitter or on any podcast app that you use. And of course, enjoy our new season 7. Thank you.